Okay, well, thanks so much for coming out today for this. What are some of the issues that you guys were thinking about that brought you here? Is this mandatory for some people, right? No, yeah, but I'm just curious. What are some issues or themes or questions that kind of attracted some people to this in particular, as opposed to another one that you could use to meet a quota, or maybe you're here of your own free volition? What are some things, issues, themes, questions? Anything? If not, that's fine. Sort of self-explanatory, evangelicalism, trauma, all of these words are in the political atmosphere right now. Jerry Falwell, Trump, and how could evangelicals, and things like that. So I'm just going to get into it. So thanks, Vince, for inviting me. There really isn't a less qualified person you could have invited. I'm really a nobody. You know, you've had a lot of people here who have great platforms and prestigious chairs and things like that. Until a few days ago, I was a jobless 30-something PhD in theology, bachelor's degree in biblical languages from Moody Bible Institute, a master's of divinity from Westminster Theological Seminary, doctor of philosophy, studying with the eminent Kevin Van Hooser, the Who's. And I haven't had this PhD for a year, but in that year, I've compiled a brief list of things for which I would eagerly exchange all 12 years of my theological education. Number one, a nice, new to me, used Hyundai Santa Fe with less than 50,000 miles. Two, $10,000, probably. Three, $100. Four, an all-you-can-eat dinner at Buca di Beppo. I love Buca di Beppo. What's my point? A year ago, I think I would have approached this lecture with a lot of arrogance, and I would have assumed that each of you owed me some degree of respect. I would have been hostile toward interrogative inquiries from the audience, but I've had some pretty life-shattering experiences recently, so I decided to sort of forego the presumptive academic trash on Balthazarian dramatic theory and speak to the issue that Vince actually asked me to speak about a little bit more from the heart, although there's certainly vast just landscapes of boring material you're going to have to suffer through in this lecture. So that's why you pay $40,000 to attend Wheaton per year, or whatever it is, right, to be forced to listen to these screeds by uncredentialed, borderline unemployable, nearly middle-aged, balding, bearded men. Nevertheless, I hope it starts an eager conversation among you young virile students. So this section I have to begin as my terms of service. This is a bad habit I got from my advisor, Kevin Van Hooser. Really not, well, yes, it is a bad habit. People write books on God or salvation, but Van Hooser is sort of, and I say this to his credit, and this is one of the reasons I think he's so great. His career is dedicated to clearing his throat before he actually makes a theological claim, right? The methodology. And so this lecture is going to be very boring and dry and pedantic and self-indulgent, because that's exactly the sort of material I think this dialogue lacks and needs, and therefore very unoriginal. So I'll recommend to you some activities instead of listening directly to me for the next 30 minutes that allows you to sort of put this on background. Number one, scrolling through Facebook. I expect that. Number two, trolling flat earther subreddits. Number three, perusing SpongeBob memes on Tumblr. Those are all legitimate, primary activities, while this becomes the secondary activity for you. I will not be offended. And you have been forewarned. But methodology really is the missing component of all modern political dialogue, and nobody shares the same first principles, and most are unwilling or unable to speak deeply about what are those first principles. We must establish them, otherwise we are engaging in radically speculative theology, which you can find in the latest halls of evangelical Twitter. And I find evangelical Twitter to be far more excruciatingly boring than politically engaged theological methodology. So, what are things that we never want to read because they're so boring, but we often make use of? Well, terms of service. Who's actually read the Twitter terms of service? But we eagerly post on there, or Google, or Instagram, and then we complain, oh, they're stealing our data. No, we just didn't read the terms of service. These are the political, methodological, theological terms of service that we need to take into account, and I'll put them in the form of 3 questions. The first question: do essences exist? Now, this might seem really irrelevant to evangelicalism and political theory, but we must begin our cultural commentary with the question, do essences exist? This is important because before we ask the question, well, how do we deal with the problems of traumatized evangelical men? We must first ask the question, well, what's the relationship between trauma and evangelicalism and masculinity? And before we can answer that, we must answer the question, well, what is trauma and evangelicalism and masculinity, or what are they, rather? And before that, we must answer the question, well, what does is mean? And so you can hear Van Hooser coming out a little bit. So what trauma is, what evangelicalism is, what masculinity is require a different sense of the term is in order to accurately describe what each one is. But before we determine what is means, we have to ask what sort of things can possibly is. And the answer to that question is subjects and objects. Now, if you're already bored, I told you this would be pedantic, okay? But before we rush to a hot take on a cultural issue, we have to nail down the metaphysics of the world in which we live and its relationship to the words we use, right? Plato, you all know this. Plato believed that the material world was shaped by or corresponded to externally existing forms, right? The form world and the material world. Physical chairs were only chairs to the degree that they manifested the form of chairness. Aristotle rejected this notion and posited that the material, the hule, and the forms, the morphe, were not two realms, or forms being the more important or the more real than matter, but rather subsisted always together in the objects known, in the hylomorphic union, right? And he called this hylomorphic union, the union of the hule and the morphe, of the matter and the form, he called this substance. And substance is the elements without which an object would not be that object. Therefore, we know we know what things are, not by reasoning upward to the form from the matter, as Plato prescribed, but rather by abstracting out the morphe, abstracting out the form from the matter. Now, advancing beyond this, Thomas Aquinas believed that even Aristotle's conception of substance needed to be modified even further. Substance was an insufficient category to capture the identity of an object in the world. If substances are combinations of form and matter, then no substance exists without matter, which ultimately collapses all metaphysical realities into functional materialism, which was Thomas's critique of Aristotle. Thomas needed some metaphysical technology which could account for the real subsistence of immaterial realities, that is, the reality of immaterial metaphysical objects in the world. Thomas thereby codified the category of essence, which is distinct from existence. This is the distinction between, in Latin, ens and esse, ENS and ESSE, between being and to be. And in order to understand existence, we must understand the distinction between actus and potentia, between, crudely translated, actuality and potentiality. Actus, or actuality, is the degree to which a thing exists, and potentia is its capability to become more actuated, to change itself, or to be acted upon. And there is only one object whose essence and existence are identical, and this is God. Again, in Thomas's view, because God's essence and existence are identical, there is no potentia in God. There's no potential in God. He is his fully actuated self. This is why theologians, if you're theology majors, raise your hands. Okay, so a few of you, this is why, theologians have called God, following Thomas, ipsum esse subsistens, existence itself. But they don't call him ipsum ens subsistens, which is being itself, which would be pantheism. Okay? But a created essence is pure potentiality, which is the opposite of God, and it is granted actuality it is granted actuality by the only being whose essence actually generates actuality, which is God. This is God. He's a pure act, actus purus, pure actuality. Essences exist only to the degree that they participate in the divine act of existence by acting according to their essences. God gives essences existence through actuating them. Okay, so that's, do essences exist? Terms of service, part 1, yes. 2, do essences have values? More than this, particular essences have certain sorts of essence-specific potentia, and therefore different versions of actus that allow them to participate in the divine esse, for them to acquire the verb is. If a male lobster wants to become a better lobster, he would make his life underwater. If a male human attempted to actuate the potentia of a lobster, he would not become a better human. He would become a dead human. And each essence has for itself a path of actuation which leads to its existence, within which lay the paths of life. And this is why, in the Thomistic model, evil is conceived as a privation, as a degradation of essences back into potentia, by failing to actuate the potentia proper to itself. This is where the existence of essences is necessary to connect metaphysical judgments to value judgments. If particular essences exist, then particular potentia exists. If particular potential exists, then essence can maximize its existence through performing tasks fitting to its appropriate actus, or it can degrade its existence by failing to perform tasks fitting to its appropriate actus. Maximizing one's existence by performing essence-appropriate tasks produces virtue. And this is, of course, there's a moral word, virtue, but Thomas uses the same word, virtue, virtus. And minimizing one's existence by performing essence-inappropriate tasks produces vice. This much Aristotle got right. The material cause of a chair is wood. Its formal cause is chairness. Its efficient cause is the chair maker, and its teleological cause, its end, its purpose for being, is sitting. What about human beings? Thomas's metaphysics fill in these blanks as well. The material cause is spirit or soul. The formal cause is humanity. Its efficient cause is God, and its teleological cause is virtue, love, and worship. Now, David Hume proposed that we should burn all our books about metaphysics and value by proposing an epistemological distinction between fact and value. But Alistair MacIntyre critiques this quite well. Hume argues that impressions, right? You're familiar with the billiard ball analogy that he uses? Hume argues that impressions are things we see, and ideas are things we impose on things we see. So his analogy of the billiard ball is, of course, that I hit one billiard ball into another, and that causes another one to hit, and therefore the metaphysician will say, aha, the law of causality. And Hume says, no, causality is something you put on that. All you observed was one billiard ball moving and then another billiard ball moving. It's a mental construct that you say, well, that's the law of causality. You didn't perceive the law of causality. It was impressed upon you that two things happened, and then you came up with an idea about how that happened. So, Hume argues in Book 3 of his treatise that we value things only because of the effect they cause on us, and we come up with ideas about them. And we learn to experience this effect through sympathy with others who experience this effect as well. A beautiful house, a fertile field, a strong horse, a new Tesla. These are all good or bad because of a euphoric feeling that we learn from others, these ideas that we come up with to make sense of the world. But we must root out the fundamental methodological materialism of Hume. Either essences exist or they don't. If they don't, then Hume is right to conclude that all value judgments are socially constructed or cognitively constructed. But he is, of course, very wrong. Essences do exist. There is such a thing as good and bad. Hume's fact-value distinction doesn't obtain to wristwatches, right? If a watch is only right twice a day, it's a bad watch. Likewise, it doesn't obtain to men. Evil exists in the world, good exists in the world, but there is no such thing as evil in the abstract or good in the abstract. There are only essences which are good or evil according to their purpose. It is evil for a human to engage in polyamory, to take multiple lovers simultaneously, right? But chimpanzees are polyamorous by nature. It's common for millennials to speak of adulting, right? Adulting is any act which properly manifests the distinguishing properties of adulthood. If you're good at being an adult, you do your laundry, you pay your bills, you brush your teeth, you eat your vegetables, all without your mother telling you to do so. Good adults are responsible. Bad adults are childish. Good humans are monogamous. Bad humans are polyamorous. Good male chimpanzees are promiscuous. Bad male chimpanzees fail to acquire a mate. Value is always value according to some particular essence. It makes no sense to speak of good or evil in the abstract. Value is the web of relations which constitutes and connects essences to one another. There is no value without essences, and there are no essences without God. But before we inquire about the traumatized evangelical man, we must first recognize that he actuates an essence in God's world by God's power and design. Otherwise, we fall back into Aristotle versus Plato, which is essentially materialism versus Gnosticism or cognitivism or something like that, neither of which can account for the existence, the real subsistence of immaterial objects in the world. And it's important to make one final note on this distinction between essential and accidental properties, essential being the indispensable properties, accidental being the dispensable properties of an object. The essential properties of an object are those which are indispensable to its identity. For a chair, it is having 4 legs with the telos of being sat upon, with a backrest of some kind. If it had 3 legs or no backrest, it'd be a stool. If it had 5 legs, well, you'd call it a 5-legged chair. But you might say, well, this is by convention. There's a conceivable world in which chairs conventionally had 5 legs instead of 4. But the telos would not change because the purpose still needs to be met. And as long as there's a necessary purpose, there's a necessary property for the tool which achieves that purpose and therefore a necessary essence. Even if that property remains elusive to articulation, the function, the need, represents a fixed, necessary metaphysical possibility, which is sitting down. This is Thomas's argument for the particularity of essences from potentiality. For every essence, there is an end, and for every holy end, there is an essence. In contrast, accidental properties are entirely dispensable. They're qualities like color, location, position, appearance. One can change these things without changing the essence of a thing. But these two contingencies raise a problem for the concept of essence, the problems of conventionality and accidentality. Take masculinity, for example. Who's to say what the essence of masculinity is? So let's say a man performs 3 tasks, right? If a man watches a football game, has an XY chromosome, and then saves a nearby woman from a mugger. Which of these 3 actions represents something indispensable to masculinity? Well, the football game is accidental and conventional, obviously, because it's a recent game, and men have existed longer than football. The XY chromosome is necessary and constitutive. The saving act is conventional and yet still metaphysically teleological. It's fitting in some way. And we'll parse this further below, but I thought it necessary to just raise this point now. The question, the necessary framework for conceiving of the question, what is masculinity? Well, we must first admit that essences exist before we allow ourselves to speak of masculinity. We shouldn't think that admitting, well, essences exist, therefore masculinity is eating a steak, right? We shouldn't think that admitting essences exist solves the definitional problem for us, which is the error that the typical fundamentalist might make, right? Nevertheless, we must recognize the philosophical value of Thomas's position for us, really the necessity of his position. The only alternative is materialism, or unjustified abstraction. Without a metaphysical world, we are reduced to Hume's conflation of perceptible reality with all of reality, or even Aristotle's, sort of cheap distinction. He was right in saying, well, the Platonic distinction between form and matter is exaggerated, and we ought to locate the form in the object itself. But he was wrong in saying that was really it was the metaphysical atom it was the metaphysical building block, rather, of his metaphysic. So without a metaphysical world, we are reduced to this Humean materialism. And Hume believed only in what he could see. And when you lose a conviction in the reality of a metaphysical aspect of the universe, not just metaphysical, but the reality of immaterial metaphysical essences, you lose purpose also. You lose teleology also. And when you forsake the qualia, the quality of being, you compromise the very possibility of teleology, of purpose. When you lose Thomistic essentialism, you get Sam Harris's theological methodology. Yeah. Does God exist? Yeah. I guess not. I don't know. That's Sam Harris's theological methodology. Nope. You get Andrew Cuomo's theological anthropology. Is this a baby? I don't see a baby. I don't know. You get feminist anthropology. What even is masculinity? I think real masculinity is being a feminist. Okay. Essentialism insists on conceiving every concept concretely, that is, from the bottom up, by means of its individuated instantiations, explicitly resisting the conflation of reality with the immaterial, as in Plato, and resisting the dependence of reality on the material, as in Aristotle. Essentialism is a way of speaking about immaterial realities that is not strictly dependent on the form-matter distinction and therefore avoids the wistful materialism of modern American secularity and the priggish traditionalism of closed-minded fundamentalists. We must be essentialists before we ask the question about masculinity or evangelicalism or trauma. My final point in my terms of service. Do words refer to essences? So we need to wrestle with the problem of the appeal to social constructivism, because I know that's what you're thinking right now. I'm assuming that each of you have taken some sort of elective on postmodernism and so know some of this stuff, but this question about whether social constructivism poses a significant epistemological problem is really an easy fight to win. The only world in which the socially constructed aspect of language obscures knowledge is in the world in which reality is already socially constructed and language is impeded by the constructional aspect of language. So the infamous sociologist Peter Berger beat to death the fact that reality was socially constructed in his landmark work, The Social Construction of Reality. And he uses male coming-of-age tropes in that book as an illustration of society's active role in shaping young boys' conception of masculinity by forcing them to choose allegiances to one group or another, and thereby to accept the scripts of that group. But Berger's methodology is unduly constrained by the phenomenological horse blinders of positivism. Right? Horse blinders are good if you're a horse, right? Or if you're a jockey especially, but they're bad if you're a sociologist. In other words, the fact that there is a measurable aspect to an object means that that's all there is to an object. That's Berger's methodology, and this is, of course, false. For sociologists like Berger, social constructivism is only a problem when one accepts the premise that all reality is socially constructed to begin with. And for social constructivists, their most basic epistemological problem becomes their first principle. And it's easily solved just by zooming out a little bit and locating social construction as a cog in a larger machine which produces accurate knowledge. And it's amazing how psychologists get this so wrong. There's this recent American Psychological Association guidelines released for treating men. That's supposed to be very evidence-based. What's the first evidence-based guideline from the American Psychological Association for therapists treating men? Gender is a social construct. Thanks for the evidence-based guideline, APA. Even the metaphor accurate assumes a shooter and a target, a knower and an object, a real person and a real world, which presumably contain essences. The role of social construction in a common-sense realist epistemology might be best put in terms of how language works, that is, how words relate to realities. So, for example, when we say the word masculinity, well, what does that mean, and why? Is it constrained by anything? There are three modern ways of looking at language, that it has 3 parts, 2 parts, and 1 part. The 3-part view of language, the triadic view, is called nomenclature linguistics. It posits that there is a sign, right, which is the collection of letters we call a word, then the signified, which is the semantic content of that word. And then there's the referent, which is the reality for which the word supplies the nomenclature, the name, the label. The essence that the word names, that's the referent. So you could call a cat an alligator, but you'd be wrong. That is, unless you lived in a world where we, by social convention, called 4-legged felines alligators, in which case you'd be right. The language doesn't change the reality in any way, and the signs are arbitrary. So some might argue from the arbitrariness of signs for a postmodern perspective, but it actually proves the fixedness of essences. Then there's the 2-part view of language, the dyadic view, which is called structuralist linguistics. And structuralism conflates the semantic content that's signified, it conflates the semantic content and the referent into a single thing, 2 parts, right? So now you only have the sign and the conflation of the referent with the signified semantic content. By construing words as meaningful, not by that to which they refer, so it erases the referent from the equation. Words are meaningful, not because of that to which they refer, but by how these words differ from other words. So for example, when I say cat, I mean that not dog animal. When I say hot, I mean that not cold temperature. And Saussure, as a philosopher, right, needed to establish a distinction between 2 concepts in order to make this system work, between the French terms langue and parole. Langue signifying the pre-existing closed set of signs that differentially determine each other's meaning, and parole signifying the practical real-time use of this set of signs by real people, right? So if I wrote, well, there's no mark, that's fine, there's whatever. Let's say I wrote the letter, it's no big deal. Does this work? What do we say? Yes or no? Does it work? Woo! Okay. What letter is that? You English privileged bigots. It's rho, right? The structuralist argues it is what it is based on what letters it's not, based on the closed systems of signs which differentially determine it. So all of the meaning of words, and of course words are composed of signs like this, and so you just abstract out and complexify a system based on that way of arguing. So that's structuralism, okay? And if you want to understand what words objectively mean, you must study the way in which they differ from the synonyms and antonyms in that same closed system. And this difference, the difference constitutes the referent itself. How the particular langue slices the lexical or even the alphabetic pie determines the way one experiences the world. Then there's the 1-part view of language, the monadic view called post-structuralism, which conflates the signified with the sign and the referent, so that they're all reduced to the differential play of signs, so that this becomes one's metaphysical methodology. Post-structuralism accepts the structuralist premise that meaning is constituted by opposition and difference rather than by nomenclaturic reference, but rejects the notion that this differential production of meaning produces anything objective. This means that for post-structuralists, the langue-parole distinction is a distinction without a difference. These concepts merely represent levels of abstraction in the speaker's own mind. The langue itself is, in this view, is a construct that hides a value judgment that benefits someone else. For the post-structuralist, every binary represents a hierarchy. If you divide something in 2, one side of the division is given some advantage. There is no such thing as a linguistic separate but equal. If words are differentially meaningful, then every word carries with it oppressive and repressive implications for the speaker and the hearer. And it is incumbent upon ethical participants in speech to deconstruct those hierarchies and to enforce equity, or what Jacques Derrida calls justice, on behalf of every marginalized word or person. Derrida goes so far as to say that we privilege the ink on the page over the space on the page. And essentialism requires from us a nomenclaturic 3-part linguistic. In other words, there are referents out there. Structuralism is wrong. Post-structuralism is wrong. That's not to say we can't learn anything from them. We certainly can. Differentiality teaches us quite a bit about semantics, meaning, and philosophy. I actually love Derrida. I think his ultimate conclusion is wrong, but he's very valuable to read. And Thomists often disregard him to their, detriment. Right? So I can't think of a word when you're talking about linguistics. It's a bit ironic. Okay, so reality is not most basically constituted through the differential semantic production of langue, as Saussure argued, nor is it inaccessible due to the irrevocable oppressive quality of a langue's differentiality. Words that refer to realities are accountable to the realities to which they refer. And because the signs which constitute the words themselves are arbitrary, words and sounds, it's incumbent upon ethical speakers to utilize whatever lexical convention supplies the highest degree of accuracy and nuance within one's community. In other words, because essences exist, speakers and hearers are obligated to use conventional words that correctly portray realities. Speakers are accountable to both the objects about which they speak and the audience to whom they speak to use conventional words with their conventional senses. The only exception is to make distinctions which add further nuance or accuracy or clarity. Anything less in the context of serious philosophical claims is sophistic, libelous, and a bad faith use of God's good gift of language. So before someone says, masculinity isn't, well, in my mind, or, I mean something special by this word that no one would recognize, but you should have recognized it, right? We must recognize that speech is a sacred act. And while the semiotics which constitute speech are themselves arbitrary, the human utilization of this speech is a deeply moral act that must be as accurate and clear as possible. Terms of service over. Now, brief definitional section, then I promise we'll get into some meatier things that I'm sure you've all brought questions about. So, now that we've briefly established that immaterial realities exist, in what manner they exist, and that the conventional quality of words is not a hindrance to objective speech, nor an objection to objective reality, but rather the basis for our obligation to use convention for the sake of accurate and clear speech, we could define our terms. These terms are evangelicalism, trauma, masculinity, the left, the right, male feminism, and red pill Christianity. Now, what is evangelicalism? Evangelicalism is an ad hoc term which means we've come up with this word in order to give a sense of unity to something that doesn't actually exist. So without the word, you might say, well, isn't that the same for all religious communities? No. Without the word Presbyterian, there's still such a thing as an institution based on the Westminster Standards. Okay? Without the word Roman Catholic, there's still the Church of Rome and its councils, right? Carl Trueman goes so far as to suggest that evangelicalism doesn't actually exist because there are no theological distinctives. I think he's wrong about that. Evangelicalism does exist, but unlike Presbyterianism and Roman Catholicism, it doesn't have its essential qualities. Its essential properties aren't theological. Its distinctives are not theological. Unlike other Christian groups who have bank accounts and uniting theological principles and documents which make their descriptors post hoc, this ad hoc term, evangelicalism, has none of these. It is a malleable culture that is defined more by practices of consumption and expression that include quiet times, a certain way of speaking about God and sin and relationships through an exclusively spiritual lens. These are the elements of evangelicalism. It is a culture more than a theological ideology. It is merely a social construction, but it is essentially a set of practices. It is not necessarily a theological movement, and because it's not necessarily theological, self-identified evangelicals do not necessarily believe anything. By convention, we might assume that evangelicals believe in Orthodox Christianity, but the evangelical self-identification of the emergent church showed us that the lack of prior documents and institutions and authorities, really because of any lack of any formal source or principle, evangelicalism will dissipate into nothingness as easily as any other fad or culture without the world losing anything theologically, right? So an atheist walks in the room and says, I'm a Presbyterian. So are you a member of a Presbyterian church? No. Do you hold to the Westminster Standards? No. Then you're not a Presbyterian. An atheist walks into the room and says, I'm an evangelical. Well, right? 2, what is the essence of trauma? Trauma is not simply overwhelm, but overwhelm to the point of breaking. The human psyche, combination of mind and soul, is not best represented by the image of broken glass in trauma, as trauma is often depicted in book covers and things like that, but more by a flexible reed, something living and organic that is both breakable and bendable. Human beings can bear stress, and the degree to which they can demonstrate resilience to that stress predicts the breaking point that becomes traumatic. So up to the point you're resilient, break. That's trauma, right? And you say, well, aren't people resilient after trauma? No, that's called recovery. These are technical terms. Read George Bonanno, resilience theory. Resilience predicts the degree to which you can withstand stress until you break. That's trauma. Trauma etymologically derives from the Greek word trauma, which means, literally, it's just, the Greek transliteration, or English is just a transliteration of that word, which literally translated means wound. And in the parable of the Good Samaritan, one of the few places it occurs in Scripture, it occurs a lot more in the Septuagint, but it occurs twice in the New Testament, I think. Once in the noun, once in the verb. In the noun here, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, the Samaritan approaches the man who was stripped and beaten, and kate desin ta traumata avtu. He bound up his wounds. And psychological trauma, in the modern sense, can actually be a lot more complex than this. As Ruth Lays put it in her University of Chicago monograph, there are two competing camps within psychological traumatology: mimetic and anti-mimetic. You're like, what? What was that word? More like a mime, right? Mimetic. Mime-tic. Mimetic and anti-mime-tic. Anti-mimetic, right? Mimetic camps believe that trauma is encoded in the subconscious so they believe that trauma is encoded in the subconscious either through psychodynamic processes or through the literal encoding of memories in the body. As Bessel van der Kolk, I'm sure you've all seen his book, The Body Keeps the Score, right? Well, he talks about the sensorometer encoding of trauma in the body, right? And it produces this encoding of it subconsciously, keeps it out of consciousness, it keeps it out of the conscious mind, but then you act it out, right? It produces an acting out of the trauma that lacks awareness of it. Kathy Carruth on the humanities side of this, Bessel van der Kolk on the psychiatric side of this. For Carruth, and for van der Kolk to a lesser degree, trauma, and if you want a really good critique of Bessel van der Kolk, read Ruth Lays' book. It's called Trauma, a Genealogy by the University of Chicago Press in 2001, way ahead of her time. But she critiques Carruth and van der Kolk quite well. And for Carruth, trauma is not any particular confrontation or conflict. We think of trauma as, oh, my parents did this to me. But that's actually, Carruth would say, that's not trauma. If it's in your consciousness, it's not. Real trauma is so serious that you actually can't deal, right? What's like the white chick mug? Can't even, right? That's trauma, according to Carruth, right? That's the deferral of confrontation. Trauma is not presence, but absence. Trauma is the avoidance, the perpetual kicking of the can of some heinously evil experience slightly beyond the horizon of consciousness. The cost of this deferral, the cost of this absence, is its constant presence. The girl abused by her father is attracted to abusive partners. The combat veteran who feels utterly alone pushes everyone away from him who loves him. The boy beaten by his father is easily wooed by the siren song of abusive older men who want to channel his anger. Anti-mimetic approaches believe that trauma is fundamentally accessible and treatable through the proper protocol. Just as a wound can be healed, the anti-mimetic school holds that trauma can be resolved with the proper protocols. The mimetic school sees this as a blasphemous claim, treading on the sacred site of heinous evil. The optimism of the anti-mimetic perspective is offensive to those for whom trauma and victimhood have become essential features of their identities. This clash between mimetic and anti-mimetic perspectives is where the essence of trauma is inflected either in the mimetic camp toward victimhood or in the anti-mimetic camp toward recovery, where trauma becomes an indispensable element of the individual's consciousness for the victim or a very dispensable and preferably dispensable element for the anti-mimetic. Now, the essence of masculinity. Now, masculinity is a real thing in the world. Men are essentially men, but what does that mean? We hear traditionalist appeals to classical masculine tropes all the time. And when we hear this, we risk reducing the identity of men with performance along a closed, cliche set of hierarchies such as sexual prowess and wealth and physical dominance, right? That's the risk of traditionalism. Me man, you woman, we make baby, right? And on the other hand, progressives, the progressive approach to masculinity, they want to identify the ideal of masculinity with psychological traits like emotional strength and sensitivity and like being maybe caring, right? And even deference and humility, right? Real masculinity is like being emotionally mature, right? That's like the progressive approach. And the problem with this, of course, is that these are all feminine strengths as well. And it fails to distinguish anything fittingly or distinctively masculine about masculinity, which makes the identification of these soft traits with masculinity a semantically vacuous designation. In Thomas Aquinas' terms, the traditional conception captures the essence of masculinity, those classical traditional masculine tropes. They capture the essence of masculinity, but it fails to capture the existence of many individual men. While the progressive leftist conception of masculinities captures the diverse experience of masculine existence, but fails to capture any kind of essence of masculinity, subverting the very need for the term. A working definition of masculinity will capture both. That's why we need a taxonomy that captures all aspects of masculinity. I propose a three-part definition of masculinity. The three parts are maleness, manliness, and manhood. Maleness is the physical aspect of masculinity, the XY chromosome. Biologists call this the male genotype. The genotype is immutable. It is unchangeable. Manliness, moving on from that, is the cultural manifestation of maleness that is fitting to the genotype. Biologists call this the male phenotype. As culture has progressed, the male phenotypes which produce overall success in a group are rewarded, and those which produce failure are denigrated and sifted out. In this regard, phenotypes are mutable and they're changeable. Phenotypes take the fact that men have on average 30% more muscle mass than women and the fact that they have an exaggerated hip-to-shoulder ratio and make phenotypical conclusions. If there's a fight, men are the ones to fight it. They are likewise, because of this, obligated not to use their physical dominance against women who are physically inferior in combat because of these basic, irreducible, irrevocable, unchangeable, immutable realities. The genotype-phenotype coupling bridges Hume's is-ought distinction. Finally, moving from maleness to manliness, we move to manhood. This is the domain of individual competencies in which the man stands upon the male and manly competencies he has cultivated and develops sophisticated masculine traits such as emotion regulation, the skills of courting and mating and husbandry and fraternity with other men and such. Okay? And it's important to have this three-part taxonomy because it forces us to recognize that there really is no material difference between masculinity and femininity in the abstract. But we must recognize that both of these words give account for embodied experience which are irreducibly binary. Masculinity and femininity cannot be theoretically differentiated deductively as if they were Platonic forms, which is how we always talk about them, right? On Twitter, masculinity is this, femininity is this. What are you talking about, right? What actually are you talking about? Masculinity and femininity cannot be differentiated in this way, as if they were Platonic forms. Platonism, which is the superstructure of both feminism and chauvinism, cannot differentiate between masculinity and femininity, or it must distinguish between them by fiat. This is the difference. It is done. By Thomism, in this scheme, the Thomistic essentialist scheme, rejecting the form-matter divide and opting for a hylomorphic approach to the world, insists that the binary male-female dichotomy dictates for us what we must justify inductively about men and women. Whatever masculinity is, it begins with the male body. Whatever femininity is, it begins with the female body, not abstraction. Genotype, maleness, gives rise to phenotype, manliness, which gives rise to individuation, which is manhood. Only in the context of a Christian world can we point to an essence and call it masculinity. Otherwise, we are subject to the tyranny of the evolutionary imperative or the plurality of the postmodern imperative, neither of which make a meaningful distinction between maleness and masculinity, neither of which can say anything philosophically or ethically substantive or justified about men or to men at all. Masculinity is the ideal toward which those with male bodies ought to strive. It is the teleology of the male essence. To the degree that a man actuates the essence of masculinity, the more he is a man. The word Thomas Aquinas used to refer to the actuation of essence was virtus, which in other cases means masculine. Fundamental to masculinity is the striving for greater self-actualization. It is to be more oneself by being greater, by participating in God's actualizing activity in the world. Okay, closing in. The essence of the left. Now we're going to comment briefly on the essence of the political binary that constitutes most political entities, the left and the right. The purpose of the left is to protect the dispossessed. Where there's a group of people or even individuals who are disadvantaged in society, the essence of the left is to help those people achieve society's status quo. Those who are left-leaning politically are typically higher in trait openness and agreeableness. The left, at its worst, is antagonistic toward tradition to the point where it seeks to outlaw traditional values or begins to attack and scapegoat the majority class or race. The essence of the right, and the purpose of the right, is to conserve institutions that have been verified to have value through the test of time, which is called tradition. It defends the norm, the group, the big picture of history, ethics, and society. It bucks against change because of the good which the established institutions preserve. The right, at its worst, is willing to heartlessly dispense with the dispossessed, doesn't care about individual experience, always deals in the abstract rather than the particular, and is willing even to actively punish those who don't conform to the norm of society. The right makes it possible for a very few to become very rich and, unchecked, can reduce to the same identity politics of the left, but on the side of the privileged group. Now, the essence of male feminism. Male feminism is a leftist perspective on masculinity. It takes the progressive approach we mentioned earlier, which captures the existence of dispossessed men who fail to align with the masculine phenotype and seeks to normalize these dispossessed experiences. The gay man, the scrawny man, the emotional man, the out-of-shape man, the poor unintelligent man, the low libido man. The male feminists take the traits which are typical of the female phenotype, caregiving, emotionally sensitive, agreeable, trait neuroticism, high in trait neuroticism, and blends them into the male phenotype so that it is no longer distinctive. The male feminist also reverses this move with women. He argues that femininity is to be assertive and physically strong and high-earning and stoic. Male feminism celebrates the masculinization of women and the feminization of men. At its best, male feminism is reacting to the tendency for men to become brutish, doltish, mouth-breathing knuckle-draggers. And at its worst, male feminism gives men permission not to conform to a higher ideal that is fitting with their basic embodied existence. And finally, red pill Christianity, or complementarianism. The red pill movement takes the traditional male tropes that men should be assertive, dominant, strong, and powerful, and that women ought to be deferential, overseen, homemaking, caregivers, and argues that the masculine imperative is to recover and institutionally establish this binary structure. The metaphor comes from the Matrix, in which the protagonist, Neo, is offered a blue pill to remain a slave to a false world and a red pill to awaken to the harshness of the real world and become a real man in that real world. There are more and less rational versions of the red pill movement. At its worst, the red pill movement is composed of men who have been treated unfairly by the legal system, treated horribly by women that they see as cruel, and consequently they advocate a return to something close to Sharia law and sex bots. At its best, the red pill movement rescues men from male feminism at its worst, which is enslaved to a feminist and feminine imperative which states that men should serve and worship women rather than pursue their own interests and ideals and wear the future as female shirts. It rescues men from the worst sort of postmodernism represented by the anti-masculinity of male feminism. It gives men a script that enables them to, at the very least, cherish and cultivate their own masculinity rather than hate it. And in this sense, red pill Christianity is a variation of complementarianism because the assertion of authority is an assertion of some kind of superiority. Military commanders are the superiors of their soldiers. Employers are the superiors of their employees. People say, oh, yeah, well, authority is not that big of a deal, right? We're complementarians. It's all equal, right? No, authority hierarchies do posit some superiority. It forbids equality of opportunity, and we have to recognize this. Now, the meat of this, the problem of traumatized evangelical men. Now that we've established that things exist and we can say things about them, and the things about which we want to speak. First, what do we need to recover? Before we can diagnose the problems, we have to envision what the teleology of masculinity is. We need to recover the belonging, autonomous man. Before we can diagnose the problems associated with traumatized evangelical men, we have to know what men ought to be. Men ought to, according to our three-part conception, cultivate their maleness, manliness, and manhood. They should seek to be physically competent, economically and intellectually competent, and relationally competent. They ought to be physically strong, economically self-sufficient, self-governing, psychologically and communally belonging. In short, we have lost in our modern day the belonging, autonomous man. We have lost the man who holds values which bind him to other people and other families with whom he has a shared history, but never compromises his free decision to be part of that community and never trades his right to be his own man for anything. Many men have been swindled out of their birthright by competing institutions who vie for their allegiance. Men will trade their autonomy for belonging within a community. They will trade it for a bowl of lentil stew. And this loss of autonomy mirrors the loss of autonomy in the experience of trauma. Religious submission and psychological overwhelm both require the relinquishing of self-governance, or what Aristotle calls autocracy, self-rulership. And men who experience this, often one and then the other, religious submission and then trauma, or more often vice versa, become depressed, resentful, bitter, or worse, culturally castrated. We need men who are more than knuckle-dragging brutes who have cultivated merely their male competencies, and we need men who are more than deferential yes men who go along with the culture or the current of some ideological script in order to find belonging. Men must find a way to stand on their own two legs within some community of other men who are standing on their own two legs, seeking the same ideals. Anything less will reduce their male experience to one of belonging at the expense of autonomy, which is cultural Marxism, or autonomy at the expense of belonging, which is a vacuum of loneliness that will end in an early death by opioid overdose. We need to recover the belonging, autonomous man. Second, trauma subverts masculine growth. At least half of our culture buys into some version of intersectionality, which would laugh at the concept of male trauma. And intersectionality is the idea that we measure entitlement by means of group victim experiences, race, class, abuse experiences, etc. And the problem is that it leaves out many forms of suffering which dispossess people who do not meet the victimhood criteria of intersectionality culture, such as men who were sexually abused as boys. These boys often grow up to be men who are either extremely aggressive or extremely docile, hypermasculine or flamboyantly homosexual. They're a very unstable, irritable, depressed, and prone to addiction and promiscuity and isolation. This is what the psychological literature bears out. We have a crisis of boys who are abused by their fathers or even simply neglected. And these boys are now men finding their way in evangelicalism. And their symptomatology is seen as sin, and their emotional dysregulation is castigated as a lack of faith. But there is a place for them within evangelicalism, particularly in Reformed communities. When I was a young boy, I was severely abused over the course of several years. If I drank the intersectionality Kool-Aid, I would try to exaggerate and puff up that abuse and maybe have a small violin that I played that make you feel a little bit more sad about my story in order to garner sympathy with you. But, I'm not going to do that. So there are many people who suffered worse than I did when I was a kid, and there are many people who didn't suffer as bad as I did as a kid, and I'm not going to pretend to care about any of them because I don't care about any of them. When I was a child, I became obsessed with guns. I would buy every issue of Guns and Ammo. I wanted everything to be fair. I wanted equality at gunpoint. I would fantasize about punishing people who threatened my family. You might think I wanted to kill my abuser, but I didn't. I loved him very much, and I still love him. He was my North Star in many ways. Even though what he did was evil, I was bound to him and will always be bound to him. As I grew in prominence in evangelicalism, I later became a Christian when I was about 16, I acted out that same reality within militant religious communities who offered me scripts of belonging. I was attracted to religious communities that were willing to offer me a rank and class in their army in exchange for undying allegiance to their cause. I was very willing. I was a willing combatant. In particular, at Westminster Theological Seminary, professors, when they saw this energy, I don't know what was going on in their minds in particular, but I was a willing combatant there. Professors asked me to perform secret missions, not to tell anyone about them, like spying on other professors and reporting them to the administration. In exchange, I had this social cachet with these Presbyterian elites in Philadelphia. I had articles published in prestigious journals. I was given a position of status, all as long as I bought into the us versus them Kool-Aid. I no longer purchased Guns and Ammo. Instead, I purchased books on presuppositional apologetics. This was all until I was suspended one semester for crossing sexual boundaries with a girlfriend 2 years prior. I was told I had broken the seventh commandment, even though we didn't have sex, and I was exiled for a semester. I had just started writing for major Christian outlets, and many of them emailed me immediately, saying they never, ever wanted to hear from me again. Soldier down. Several years later, the administrator who oversaw my suspension was himself fired and stripped of his ordination credentials for some unnamed serious moral issue, they called it. Traumatized men cannot fittingly belong within evangelicalism, and if they can, it is a pretend belonging. I'm not saying that traumatized men can't thrive in their faith as Christians. They certainly can. I'm talking about the politics of insider baseball that goes on behind the curtain of evangelical institutions. Men are purchased and traded and gagged into compliance, but for traumatized men especially, we do so willingly. We sell our souls willingly. We will trade our autonomy, we will even trade our human dignity for anything resembling a father. Moreover, any moral imperfection, and among traumatized men, moral imperfections are not hard to find. Moral imperfections are used as the basis for social exile as soon as they become inconvenient to the institution's agenda. The evangelical intolerance for moral impurity, especially sexual impurity, makes the relational nightmare of every abused boy come to life as every layer of intimacy further freezes them in a state of paranoia and pretend perfection, further isolating the false self from the real self, which are already torn asunder in the initial trauma. Evangelicalism is the fantasy and terror for the traumatized man. It promises everything, requires everything, and punishes severely. Third, there's a crisis of paternity within evangelicalism. Evangelical authorities want all the benefits of control without any of the responsibility. Evangelicals will tend to stress the obligation of men to submit to a local church. You've heard this rhetoric. Submit to, are you in a local church? Are you submitting to a local church? Without delineating the responsibilities of the church to that man. Evangelical institutions are, for the most part, reluctant to give and eager to take. Evangelical father figures, for the most part, serve their own interests and the interests of the institution that they represent. They only invest their time and energies in men who fall within a very close bounded bracket of behaviors and beliefs. The cost of all of this, men sacrificing their autonomy for belonging, is that they no longer become men. They call for men within their ranks to become ideological martyrs, ideological kamikazes, sacrificing themselves for a cause just for the sake of this cause. And I've seen enough institutions to know that every employee has a boss, and every boss works for a president, and every president is accountable to a board of directors with lots of money, and that money is the bottom line of that culture. Number 4, higher education very often derails men from becoming men, especially theological evangelical higher education. The biggest mistake I made in my 20s was idolizing men who my father never would have respected. There are many men in higher education who are only respected by other men in higher education and not by real men. This is the same for pastors. There are many men who are only respected by other pastors and not by real men. This manifests itself in the academy in several ways. First, it has become common to speak of a theology of the body. Why does everyone who cares so much about a theology of the body looks like they've never done anything with their bodies? Why is the avatar of progressive Christianity the skinny, fat, white male hipster? And why does the avatar of complementarian, conservative evangelicalism, so-called traditional Christian gender theory, look exactly the same? Real men know that masculinity is irrevocably meritocratic. Masculinity is measured far more by what you do than by what you believe. In this regard, evangelical theologies of the body fall short insofar as their medium is constrained to theological eggheadery, a profoundly incomplete and inappropriate forum for expressing an embodied masculine theology. Second, why does all our theology of the body terminate on sacramentology and bioethics? What about the common bodily realities like exercise and healthy eating that constitute 90% of our male lives? Why do I have to go to hot yoga to resolve more of my existential spirituality than a theology collection? Third, theological educators need to be much better at mentoring. The academy rewards isolation. It rewards publications and lectures, but it doesn't reward relationships, and this is to the detriment of the academy and young theologians. Almost every single PhD student in my class expressed to me profound isolation, even while publicly feeling the need to praise their advisor and the institution. They're amazing. I love them. One student even tragically ended her life. And what did they say? Well, she had serious mental health issues. Yes, couldn't be our fault at all. There is no prompt even to reconsider the structure of the divinity school that accommodated those problems. For a long time, I reached out to older men, and this is on me. This may sound like a screed against evangelicalism. It's not. For a long time, I reached out to older men and begged them to mentor me. I needed their love. I remember sitting in the offices of one prominent evangelical author in whose institution I worked as a marketer, and I asked him, I just need to know, do you like me? And he responded, Paul, I don't know you. I was desperate for approval. I would have sold my soul for it. Most evangelical men would sell their souls for the approval of evangelical celebrities. Fourth, evangelical theology professors do not inspire young men viscerally, which is how young men are inspired. Look at your average evangelical theology professor. If he really had a biblical anthropology, he would look like he cares for his body. Instead, he flaunts his secular hedonism and sloth in the form of physical weakness and obesity. Fifth, evangelical theological academia is irrelevant to daily life. And it isn't irrelevant because it gets lost in the nuance and minutiae of scholastic inquiry. It actually ought to do that. But because it gets distracted by historiographical he said, she said, conceptually vacuous name-dropping, and meaningless metaphor, rather than the task of cultivating the real maturation of intellectual and disciplined men and women. Evangelical academia is a self-interested, narcissistic enterprise which contains some good men who remain good in spite of the nature of their institution. It becomes complicit in incentivizing the sort of compliance which erases self-governance. Answer me this question. How is it ethical to charge somebody $40,000 a year for a Bible degree? It's not. 5, labels become proxies for real masculinity, especially on the internet. Some evangelicals might respond, well, you might think evangelicalism is bad, but it's no worse than other groups. Correct. The problem isn't just with evangelicalism, it is with group identification in general. As these male feminist red pill movements emerge, we can see that the labels themselves become proxies for real masculinity. Instead of doing masculine things and cultivating masculine competencies, many of these masculinity ideologies becomes obsessed with talking about masculinity. There's nothing wrong with talking about being a real man, but I'd much rather spend time being a real man. It's much more valuable, fun, and rewarding. Evangelicalism works the same way, but with regards to faith, especially in social media, particularly within militant self-identifying institutions. These become proxies for faith. Look at your average evangelical seminarian's Twitter profile. MDiv, SBTS, graduate of TEDS, marketing manager, MBTS. It is an obsession, a toxic, unhealthy obsession with affiliation. It's a self-branding. This is toxic masculinity. Because when we can see what masculinity ought to be, we can stop thinking about toxic masculinity, first of all, in terms of what sort of masculinity is toxic to others, and what sort of masculinity, rather, is toxic to men themselves. Tribalism is not toxic to men. The quest for fatherly love within the halls of an ideology that is self-serving, that is toxic to men. And on the internet, both faith and masculinity become disembodied, which is the perfect proxy for trauma. Then these three collide on Twitter. Evangelicalism, masculinity, and trauma all become substituted for superficial avatars of each of them in online debates. Then we are no longer confessing our faith or being real men or resolving our trauma. We're just sitting there, staring with anxiety at our phones, sitting at the green light while other people honk at us. That's life. And the sooner we can exchange these proxies, which are ideologies, for real, stand-on-your-own-two-legs masculinity out there in the real world, off of social media, and more than off of social media, unconcerned with social media, the better we will be. And I am the most guilty of this. The more manly we will be, the more at peace we will be, the more healed we will be. 6, evangelicals should resist the extremes of left and right. I'm going to skip this part. I basically covered that. In conclusion, we'll close on trauma. We noted that one of the few places in Scripture where the noun is actually used, the noun trauma, is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Often this parable is used to warn against being the aloft Pharisee and to commend being the Samaritan. But many men today are more akin to the man on the side of the road, beaten, robbed, and alone. He hopes every older man will be the Samaritan who takes him in and gives him ideological lodging. And evangelicals claim to do this, but the truth is that this Samaritan is simply not coming. This man on the side of the road, you and me, he must pick himself up, bandage his own wounds, and pay for his own lodging. This is the only way forward, not because it ought to be this way, but because nobody wants to lodge the traumatized adult male in the early stages of his recovery. The Discovery Channel airs a show called Naked and Afraid, the premise being that a man and woman are dropped into the wilderness in the nude for 21 days and told to survive without being given food, water, or clothes. Evangelicalism's version of masculinity is a bit like that. It requires everything and gives nothing. Evangelicalism requires the hardest moral feats from men: maturity, responsibility, success, depriving them of all the necessary resources, secular wisdom, male intimacy, valuation of the physical body. A culture that insists always on speaking in biblical terms, using biblical categories to make one's way through the hardest challenges of life utterly alone, forces every man into the desperate situation of having to reinvent the existential wheel all over again for himself. And this is the challenge that all men who self-identify as evangelicals face. It is what Plato wrote in his story about Euthyphro. Euthyphro's dilemma is always co-opted by moral philosophy. Is justice just because it's willed by the gods, or is it willed by the gods because it's just? We forget that the whole conflict between Socrates and Euthyphro began with Euthyphro bringing his father to court to kill him, wanting to condemn his father to death for mistreating a slave, which Socrates found to be a heinous and haughty disloyalty that signaled a deeper moral rot than the abuse itself. Euthyphro's real dilemma still remains for us, not the question of the origin of justice, but the question, am I willing to condemn my own father to death because of my smug sense of self-righteousness that I get from being an evangelical or being a male feminist or being a red pill or being a complementarian? The answer among young evangelical men is clearly yes, and for me it was yes for so long. When you hear conversion stories on both sides, right? Conversion to the left, salvation from this judgmental, fundamentalist God, right? Or conversion to the right, salvation from this meaningless, therapeutic, moralistic deism. We all want our present selves to be explained with a condemnation of our fathers rather than a responsibility, a moral responsibility for ourselves. Militant leftism and conservatism are mirror images of one another, and they are both expressions of victim culture. The subsumation of personal identity into ideology, as well as the revulsion of ideology for the sake of self-improvement, both lack a sense of self. I hate Martin Heidegger almost more than anyone else in the world because he has the most unearned philosophical cachet of anyone in the history of philosophy anywhere. But I am beginning to understand what he means by Dasein. Dasein, being in the world, is an apophatic way of resisting the twin hydra heads of individualism and communitarianism. Every boy sits in the crisis of Buddy from The Incredibles. Buddy worships Mr. Incredible and calls himself Incrediboy. And when he is rejected by Mr. Incredible, he becomes Syndrome. This doesn't mean that Buddy was a bad kid, but the rejection catalyzed his turn to evil. Because he can't be Incrediboy and he's rejected by Mr. Incredible, he'd rather become Mr. Incredible's villain than form his own super identity, than individuate himself as a man. You see this in Reformed progressive conversion stories. In lieu of male initiation rites, we have escape stories, but we call them conversion stories. In a world where every man must find a conversion story to legitimize his place, and this world is evangelicalism, we create a script for men in which the only way to belong is to be displaced. And the only way to be an evangelical is to sojourn there. The cost of admission to evangelical belonging is self-exile. Our most intimate sense of belonging for men within evangelicalism is one deeply fraught with estrangement and isolation. This estrangement from our homes and isolation from others is required by conversion. We must always think of ourselves as having been converted, and we forbid the valuation of our own origin stories. Instead of bearing the fruition and fulfillment of our Father's dreams, we hate them. We hate them. We hate our fathers and our mothers and our parents. All of our problems are, I used to be. All of our sins are once upon a time. All of our pathologies are, well, when I was young. All our deficiencies are, well, they taught me this, but then I found the truth. Conversionism isn't an unction towards salvation, but a posture that always defers taking responsibility for our present shortcomings. In this regard, fundamentalist evangelicalism and shrieking progressivism are both cultures of victimhood. Both are culturally Marxist, sending everyone else, even their own parents, especially their parents, to the gulag. We must pass the Euthyphro test to be evangelical men. Will we betray our fathers in exchange for the optics of being men? Or will we be satisfied to live outside the camp, outside the spotlight, without a blue check mark, satisfied to stand on our own 2 feet? Will that be enough for us? These are the questions that traumatized evangelical men must face. Are we willing to belong in a space outside the evangelical spotlight? And are we willing to stand on our own 2 feet strongly enough to resist the Faustian satanic bargain of belonging offered to us by evangelical insiders? For the sake of Christian men and women everywhere, I hope the answer to both of these questions for myself and for all of us is yes. That is all. Yeah.
Maxwell. There's like a bunch of questions I could ask, but first, by the way, I don't think you should be qualified. Let's get that part off the table. So clearly, you're very qualified to talk about that. You said you weren't.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah.
So I just want to say that. Tell us about what it was in seeing the film Logan that, where you kind of told us what that was, but
Yeah.
I think it'd be interesting for us to hear that.
Yeah. Has anybody here not seen Logan? Okay. Anybody planning on seeing Logan who hasn't seen it? Great. You. That's okay. I will, for your sake, I consider it sacred. Spoilers are absolutely sacred. You shouldn't feel guilty about that at all. Yeah, okay. So, there is a moment when, this won't spoil anything. Logan, you're familiar, Hugh Jackman, Wolverine, X-Men franchise. So he's speaking to another mutant who has been sort of co-opted and by the government to become this fighting combatant thing, and it's a younger mutant, and he kind of sees himself in her. And he sees her becoming this vicious, warmongering, violent person. And he just says to her this line, "Don't be who they made you." Don't be who they made you. Evangelicalism incentivizes us to be militant, to be aggressive. But there's something good about aggression. There's something good and distinctively male about assertiveness and aggression and testosterone and steak and all of that stuff. It's good. Something good about liking Wolverine, you know? What's her name? What's Schwarzenegger's ex-wife's name? Maria Shriver. Came out this movie a few years ago about how action movies are ruining men. It's toxic masculinity. It's like there's just nothing Freudian going on there at all, right? But it's like, no, they're not. Yes, film could absolutely distort masculinity. It could film consumed the wrong way or with the wrong message could absolutely be bad for us. There's nothing wrong with action, but the bastardization of masculinity by evangelical institutions who have opportunized on this is, it's what I experienced personally at Westminster, and I take full responsibility for it. Listen, obviously I think there are things that are wrong with evangelicalism, especially Reformed, New Calvinist-esque Christianity that brings the worst out of some of the best parts of us. But yeah, that really resonated with me because at that sense I felt lost, I felt angry, and at that moment I just felt this sense of release. I felt like I had a choice. I don't have to be this man. I don't have to even have a Twitter account. I don't, all of it. Just let it go. Just let it go. So that's what it was. I felt it was the first moment since, and in it, for, I don't know, maybe a decade, that I had felt this release from it all. This release from the training. This release from this, who are you? Like the Terminator, listen, weaknesses, and that mindset. And it's like, I still feel that impulse, I'm a behaviorist, so all that stuff, it's all still ingrained in you, the instincts, but yeah, so I love that movie for that reason. Yeah, anyway. Any other questions or comments? Interpretive dances.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, I had a question.
Have we met before?
We have.
Oh.
I'm pretty sure we're at Moody together.
Oh, yeah, cool.
Did we take biblical theology of suffering? Dr. Schmutzer, Peterman?
Oh yeah, sorry. So the question, yes, we have, sorry, I have to say this for the microphone for this. Yes, we did not take biblical theology of suffering together. I took Old Testament theology with Andrew Schmutzer, but we may, I recognize, absolutely. So I totally can place you there now. So yeah.
That was my question.
Okay.
I was curious to know your thoughts about Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
A lot of what you've been saying, I'm just hearing echoes from his writings,
Totally.
his lectures, his debates.
Yes, absolutely.
What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I love a lot. I love, let me just say this without qualification first. I really love what Jordan Peterson says. And for the first time, I felt like, oh, wow, I can be a free-thinking person who values ideals. I don't have to choose between rigid communitarian slavery of traditionalism and the, wish-wash relativism of postmodernism. He uses Heidegger in his 12 Rules for Life. He appeals to Dasein explicitly as this. Heidegger used this concept of Dasein as a way to hold in tension the subject and the object in the same word, subjectivity and objectivity. I like that because as much as I hate it, because I hate centrism, I think it confuses things. Man, you get tired of the dialectic after a while. You get tired of running back and forth between, Jacques Derrida and Cornelius Van Til, just constantly going back and forth. And that's where he really gave me this home of like, hey, like let's. Really, I think there's so many people you could liken Peterson to. I really would liken him to Edmund Husserl and his concept of the epoche, the bracketing, where we say, well, what about essences, and what about metaphysics, and what about scripture, and what about Hebrews 12, and what about, it's like, hey, let's just bracket this, and let's just focus for a second on what's right in front of us, and then let's work out from there. And let's abstract from that. And the problem with that, of course, the problem with that is that it's groundless. And that's Peterson's biggest unanswered question so far, is that when you ask him about Jesus or you ask him about Christianity, it's like, oh, so stupid. Like, he's so evasive. And he's like, well, I don't want to come down on it. And it's like, you have to be who you are. Like, I would say to Peterson, listen, you have to be understanding of people who are tracking with you A through Y, and then you get to Z, and you're like, well, I don't know. It's like, it's not you. It's disingenuous to go that far and then just stop right before the finish line. So that's what I really find unsatisfying about Peterson. Aside from him stopping short of being a confessing Christian, which I find so disappointing, I love almost everything the guy says. Yeah. Yeah.
Towards
totally resonate with that. I think that comes with now being young, reckless, and reformed, that there's this whole other aspect that you need to attain. But I don't think you kind of left it there. Could you like flesh that out more of your experience and what is like a practical solution or way of escaping that temptation? Is there any good in that at all? Of those? Yeah.
Right. So the question is, I kind of was pretty hard on social media and the role it plays in the formation of masculine evangelical identity. Could we find a good place for social media? Here's the thing. My experience with it was at Westminster. I started Westminster Theological Seminary in 2010, right as Twitter was really starting to become popular. That was my first year there. And I just became tight with a lot of the young guys who were tight with the administration. You'd go to these guys' houses. And the thing is, you'd be on Twitter, but then you'd commiserate at people's houses. You'd be like, that guy's so stupid. This guy's not this enough. That guy's not that enough. And there are two ways that social media can become unhealthy in that way. One of them is in the way that it's a medium, really a forum for social bonding that creates unhealthy, real local communities, like what I think exists at Westminster or many other places, or it really isolates you, and your avatar becomes like the hub of all your emotional experience. And when you're, Twitter, these social media platforms employ behavioral psychologists. They are messing with our emotions. Their goal is to own your emotions enough that you keep going back and back and back and back and back, because we are not the clients of social media. Advertisers are clients of social media. Their job is to exploit us and our emotions as much as possible, and the only way to keep us coming back and back and back is to compel us to do so. We already have enough compulsions. We already have enough anxiety. It exacerbates that so much. So as I would say, maybe like 2008 Twitter, 2008 Facebook might have had a good place. The idea of these social media platforms in the abstract could be good. For some of their stated purposes, like you need anonymity and different things like that. Yeah, I get it, like journalists need to be able to break stuff without compromising their job or their safety. But 2018, 2019 Twitter, 2018, 2019 Facebook, I don't think there's a good place for it. And I think that, I think most of us practically, maybe you could make an abstract argument for it. I think most of us practically don't have the self-control to be intentionally embodied enough in our relationships and in our doing theology to really control ourselves. I certainly don't. I'm wrestling with that question right now with my wife. She's like, get off with social media because it's ruining your emotional life, and that affects our marriage. And I'm like, ugh, I hate being married. Now I have to like care about this person, and it's, of course I love being married, but in those moments I'm like, I wish I could just indulge the worst parts of myself, and are there people who are virtuous and good at social media? I think the people who we see as being really good at social media probably don't even control their Twitter handles. They have some social media intern doing it. So I would say no, but I might be able to be changed on that position. I would just have to see it. I just don't see it right now. I don't see it being used for good. I don't see it producing positive emotional health in anybody. Even though you could maybe make an argument it's doing utilitarian good in the world, I would maybe be open to that argument or something. But that's it. It's a good question. Part of it's I'm just personally exhausted by it, so that tints my answer a little bit, but it's a good question. Yeah.
So when you were talking about the two different left-right ideologies and how they kind of go back and forth off each other, and I was thinking about this on the way here, the kind of morality is based off what the other person thinks is right or wrong. Like it's pretty much just based off, okay, we don't like that group, so that's our morality, essentially not liking them.
Right.
Is our group, and so like that would be a really bad example of kind of a way to, like you were saying, be masculine. Like that's not necessarily a good example of being manly. It's like, no, I don't like this specific set of principles or this specific group or whatever. And since we were talking about superheroes, I thought I'd give an example.
That's good.
That works in that kind of universe. So Batman refuses to kill under any circumstances. Would you say that that's like probably the best way to be manly, have your own set of principles, and so no one can mess with it, even no matter what the world throws at you? You can't, they can't throw you off.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, and I'm going to say this in a reductionistic way for the camera. So, but hopefully my answer will do more justice to your question. But the question essentially is, morality easily becomes hating the other group, hating the left or hating the right is a better way to be a man, to have your own principles and hone them the best that you can. And don't let anybody else own them or control them. Like Batman, for example, with his rule not to kill. I like every 99.99999% of my being viscerally wants to say that is the answer. But I don't think it is the answer because at the end of the day, the rogue, the Ronin, the ninja, the samurai without a master, he's aimless and his purpose is groundless. And he might be right, but he doesn't have access to the phenotype. He doesn't have direct access because the phenotype is the inherited traditions. It's the inherited values. And every man, no man really makes everything up from the ground. No man really makes everything up for himself. So I think we have to be embedded communally at least enough to do justice to the fact that we need other people checking our math, on our ethical math, our axiological math.
Right. So that was more, I was asking more like, as in sticking to the biblical principles.
Oh, I see.
You can't move from that, essentially. It's not,
right.
It's not based off group anything. It's essentially just, I stick to the Bible, Ten Commandments.
Right.
This is what it says. So
you're saying, right, so the Batman ethic as an example of, a categorical example of biblical revelation, I would say then the answer, as long as I would say there's still still an ethical obligation to be embedded for you, the sake of your own, assuming you're a man and you want to have a family, for the sake of your family, it is your obligation to embed them in a community that you can be kept in check with. With that qualification, revelation is where the buck stops, and that has its own philosophical arguments, but absolutely yes. Then you have to, but then having said that, you have to be your own man, and ultimately at the end of the day, we need to recover Kierkegaard in that sense, that, or really I think it was Hudson Taylor who said, a man is who he is on his knees before God and no more. Absolutely. And that sense of me and God, Jacob wrestling with God, 100%, that we need to recover that sense of spirituality, authenticity, rather than compliance. Because, what Kierkegaard said, what labels me negates me. I think that he's right. More right than wrong anyway. And because, at least in our culture, we are much more willing to be labeled and negated for the sake of scratching an existential itch, a relational itch. And I think we're giving up, again, to go back to Jacob and Esau, I think, we're selling our souls, we're selling our birthrights for lentil soup when we do that. When we say, TEDS, SBTS, Westminster, this, red pill, feminism. Anyway,
One final question.
So first of all, just thanks so much for coming out. I'm a huge fan of your YouTube channel, and I've noticed there hasn't been updates about the last month or so. Do you intend to start a new podcast or a new channel outlet for your ideas, and if so, what's that going to be?
It's a great question. So the question is, my podcast has stopped uploading for a while. Do I intend to start a new one? Right now, life's been crazy for the past month and a half, weird circumstances I won't totally get into, but I hope that could one day be a possibility, but we'll have to see. I really appreciate the question. I really appreciate you saying that. Could I make room for one more question? Not to be, this is very, very intersectional of me, but is there a woman who wants to ask a question? About evangelicalism and masculinity? Is there any female perspective who wants? If not, that's totally fine. Yes? Yeah.
So this isn't necessarily from a female perspective,
Yeah.
but just one thing you said really made me curious. You were talking about humanitarianization and how real men often don't respect them for various reasons, and then you followed up by saying that masculinity ought to be measured more by what men do. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know it's a little bit of an inflammatory term, like real men, right? What is that? Well, going back to real goes back to what is. To be real is to exist, right? Which goes back to essence. So what men actuate essence. And if we define essence the way I defined it, the masculine essence, which is maleness, which then founds, the male genotype, the manly phenotype, manhood, which is the individuation of that. And you have to go up. You have to work from the ground up to that. If you just focus on the individuation without having male and manly competencies, it's not distinctively masculine at that point. It's just, I'm emotionally intuitive and relationally blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, women are that too, right? Begin with the male body, the embodied male experience. So I think that real men are people who take seriously the fundamental competencies that men have to have, which is economic self-sufficiency eventually, but even more foundational to that, physical competencies as much as they can. That defines real men. And one of the ways that you kind of know this is this distinction between academic intelligentsia type guys and blue-collar type guys. They often talk way past each other, and the thing is that intelligentsia guys are very self-conscious about who approves of what they believe. Blue-collar guys just don't care. And I think that's a better indicator of a real man, because at the end of the day, you want a masculinity that supplies existential security. And so much of academia, so much of the masculine intelligentsia is so concerned with status, and I think that's a very unmanly thing. And so when I say real man, I don't mean to imply that, well, if you have your PhD, you're not a real man. Like intellectual gifts can be an extension of masculinity. It can be a manifestation of masculinity, and men are respected for being intellectual men, right? But if that's all that it is, then it's not actually masculinity, I think. It's not really an extension of that. So that's kind of maybe what I was looking at. It's a really good question, though. That was maybe one of the holes there that I was going past. I was like, hope nobody asked what this means, but you saw the hole, and that was really good. So yeah.